Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Reviews. The book that I have here to tell you about today is by Gordon Marino, and it's called the Existentialist Survival Guide. So that already gives you a good sense of what the topics are going to be if you know anything about existentialism. And I will tell you that this is a book review series in which I take a look, an unvarnished look, at works in philosophy in a very broad sense. So including things like applied ethics or philosophical psychology, the emotions, leadership, self-help, personal development. So this book fits in solidly here. It is deeply informed by philosophy, but it's also supposed to be about our own lives. And, you could think of it as a personal development book in a certain way, as we'll talk about in just a bit. I always like to begin these reviews by talking about three main S's: the style of the work, the structure of it, and providing a kind of summary. So Marino is an academic, but he's one who's very accessible. So, it's a good book for bridging the gap between popular writing that non-academics can definitely get into, and it's got academic rigor to it, and that's reflected in the prose itself. Obviously, taking the existentialists as interlocutors is going to, kind of lead in that way as well, because it wasn't a philosophy that was strictly academic, written primarily for philosophers to other philosophers, but, for a much broader audience, or sometimes even in some cases to a much smaller audience as well. And this is, interestingly, so he describes it at the start. He says, I want this to be an honest book. And it is an honest book, as we're going to talk about, particularly later when we get to the strengths. There's a lot of Marino's own, let's call it philosophical, thoughtful, retrospective, autobiography going on within the work. It is not an autobiography as such, but it is certainly one that is honest about successes, failures, fears, moments of courage, all those sorts of matters within his life. Its aim, as he says, and this is in the introduction, I think we learn much about the point of the book, which is kind of the summary, by looking at what he says in the introduction and then the epilogue. So he tells us that his goal is to articulate the life-enhancing insights of the existentialists. So, he's going to be telling us about how we can make sense out of our lives in a way that isn't all doom and gloom, but actually takes the doomy, gloomy things quite seriously. And he says, who are they or me, their apostle, to pass along life prescriptions? And he's going to give us some, good reasons for thinking that. He says, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and other existentialist thinkers faced life unblinkered and were nevertheless able to lead authentic lives and keep their heads and hearts intact. And so that's a main theme of the work. He also tells us that the existentialism that helped sustain him is personal in nature, right? Representatives of this approach think about existence from the inside out, and that's part of what he's doing. Now, later in the epilogue, we're going to learn that he says, this is a survival guide. That's the rubric, but the book is not a Baedeker on how to lead a happier or happy life. The assumption underlying these meditations is that for all the jottings in your gratitude journal leading to an authentic life remains a Sisyphean labor, something rolling the ball up the hill and then it goes back down, right? So he says that he recognized in the existentialists the hard fact that life is not a romantic journey, but a daunting trek, right? So it's a work for people who are having lives that aren't going completely ideally. And, that turns out to be all of us if we're actually paying attention. At the very end of it, he's going to tell us the how-to in this book is one of how to lead an authentic life in an inauthentic world, right? So I think that's a good summary of what's going on here. Now, the structure of the work, it is divided into thematic chapters. We do have an introduction. We have an epilogue. There are some notes at the end. There's an acknowledgments. And then we have all of these chapters with the following titles: anxiety, depression and despair, death, authenticity, faith, morality, love. These are all important philosophical topics. They are all things that come up within the existentialists, certainly the ones that Marino is going to take us through. So this is, I would say, a decent overview of what you're getting into with this particular work as you go through it. What are the key ideas that you're going to engage with in this work? Well, I'm going to lead you through them in this section. First, he tells us that the existentialists are hard to classify in what he calls a muster list, the roster of who counts as an existentialist and who doesn't. And he's going to provide you with a little bit of background about 20th century philosophy. Here in America, at least, it was largely analytic philosophy on the one side and then existential and phenomenological philosophy on the other side. There was a lot of other stuff going on as well, but he passes over that. And then he tells us that there's essentially two main strands of existentialist philosophy. One he associates with phenomenology, starting with Husserl, who he discusses a little bit. And he's not really that interested in Husserl for Husserl's sake. He wants to talk about Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. And so those are, providing us with some of the practitioners of the phenomenological method. And then he says, and this is the ones that he's probably attracted to more, there's another cadre of existential thinkers to whom existential still implies attending to concrete existence, who avoid floating off into abstract theories detached from reality. Who does he bring up here? Kierkegaard, Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Miguel de Unamuno, Albert Camus, and he says others. So, that's a decent summary of who he's going to be looking at. He tells us that the question of meaning is paramount for the existentialists, as well as the issue of authenticity, and that moods play an incredibly important role as well. Attentiveness to moods, to affectivity, right? And then he brings up this issue that we already talked about a little bit. Existentialism is in part philosophy carried out in a first-person perspective, even if it's the phenomenological type of existentialism. So he says that the existentialism that was my lifeline is a first-person way of thinking. And he then tells us about how Kierkegaard and company became, as he calls it, his walking partners. Now, Kierkegaard is going to play a massive role within this work, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. But he does tell an interesting story at this point in the introduction about why existentialism drew him in and became particularly useful and important in his own life. Then we jump into the first chapter about anxiety, and he's going to talk first about our society's typical attitude towards that, which is to treat it as largely a psychological and specifically medical problem that maybe we should just get pills for. And he also looks at, Freudian psychology, which was sort of the predecessor, ruling the roost psychotherapeutic approach before the cognitive approaches rose and the drug therapy approaches became ubiquitous. And he says, none of these are really getting to what anxiety truly is. Who do we learn from? Well, Søren Kierkegaard. He says, Kierkegaard depicts anxiety from diverse angles, but like another depth psychologist, he discerned we have our defenses against anxiety, our ways of deflecting it, and that anxiety is something that can be within us without our realizing its presence. He's also going to say that Kierkegaard views anxiety as a sympathetic antipathy and antipathetic sympathy, right? Anxiety is a desire for what one fears. So it's this very interesting, ambiguous mood as we're going to discern. And he'll take this up again. Kierkegaard's point of view. He says, for Kierkegaard, humans are uniquely paradoxical creatures, walking and talking contradictions. We are a synthesis of the temporal and eternal, the finite and infinite, necessity and possibility. But we're not just a synthesis. We're charged with the thorny task of relating these two aspects to each other. And that, he says, is an anxiety-inducing responsibility. So, anxiety is a pretty important part of the discussion here. There's also a little bit of discussion of the existential psychologists, and of course a little bit of, you couldn't not talk about Heidegger. And then he moves on to depression and despair. And I think one of the very interesting things that he's going to talk about here, in addition to telling us his own, life story about this, is that Kierkegaard is going to be quite helpful with this. But we also see that one reason that's the case is that Kierkegaard acknowledges his own depression, right? His most faithful mistress, but doesn't view it as the same thing as despair, which a lot of people in the present do. They confuse these things together. So he's going to say that, here we go, that I encountered something in Kierkegaard that shed fresh light on my darkling inner life, a long-lost distinction between depression and despair, between a psychological and a spiritual disorder, right? Though many Americans blithely talk about being spiritual, they seldom, if ever, distinguish between psychological and spiritual maladies. And, despair is something that we have to treat in different ways. You're not going to take antidepressants and get yourself out of philosophical despair, existential despair. It's a mood, and he notes that, like anxiety, with fear, you can say, I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of this. Anxiety is more diffuse for the existentialists. Despair is like that too. It's not just sorrow, it's not just sadness about one thing or another. And we can even say that about depression. As he says, depression is a first cousin of angst, right? It can be an inexplicable sadness. Then he's going to draw on Kierkegaard some more, and a distinction between what we can call our concrete selves, the selves that we think we are, the ideal selves that we would like to be and often orient our current present towards achieving, and then what he calls the third self, the true self, the one that is not particularly interesting in and of itself, having nothing to do with your station or accomplishments, but it is what, rests transparently in God. And so he says, Kierkegaard suspects people who fulfill their ideal selves will be inclined to think they've hit the bullseye of life and never truly develop their genuine self, right? So that can land them easily in despair. So let's move on to the next chapter, which is death. He begins by talking about, and this should be a regular theme by now, thanatology, meaning that there's an ology for handling the concerns that we have, rather than, an authentic approach to it that existentialism would provide us with. Then he says, there's an august tradition in philosophy on meditating on death, and so the existentialists are kind of taking this up. He brings up Tolstoy's novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and Tolstoy's own case, his own experience, his own depression that he went into for quite a bit. And he's got an interesting read on it here, and he says, we don't want to reduce a novel or poem to a message fit for an index or Hallmark card, as though if Tolstoy were really intelligent, he would have stopped teasing us and just straightforwardly informed us what his novel meant. But the Tolstoy of Ivan Ilyich wanted his readers to understand that with its lack of authenticity and brotherly love, modern life is spiritual death. Right? So there's quite a few pages that are given to this. And then he brings up Kierkegaard's At a Graveside and draws some interesting things out of that as well. And he's going to talk about how death is, it's closing off all of our options, all of our possibilities. And then he shifts to Nietzsche. What does Nietzsche actually think? Nietzsche is more about life and not so much about worrying about death. And he brings up Rieff, a close reader of Nietzsche, who once quipped, you only live once, if then. Nietzsche would have counseled, don't be a fool and squander that one life, morosely pondering the end of that life. And he sort of places him in a dialogue, we could say, with Kierkegaard. What is Kierkegaard going to suggest to us? Well, we should think about our death, but we should think about it in the right way. And so near the end of the chapter, he says, anyone who aspires to think earnestly about death must include the heavy-heartedness that comes when the ties that bind break. This is kind of a paradox of it. If you're anticipating a wonderful afterlife, you still feel bad about the dying, right? This is kind of the strange thing for many people. Then we go into yet another really key existentialist theme in chapter 4, authenticity. And he's concerned with, well, what does authenticity actually mean? Does it mean following your passion, doing what you want? And he's saying, no, that's really not going to be it. And he also notes that we often will have a fear of being inauthentic. And he admits to some of his own experiences like that. One I'll bring up that's quite interesting, where he's a boxer and he gets to becomes a boxing writer. He gets to hang out with Mike Tyson, and Mike Tyson addresses him saying, guys like you and me, and he says, I suppose I'd pulled the charade off, or Iron Mike let me think I pulled it off, but immediately I felt the body blow of inauthenticity. I didn't correct Tyson, but I felt like the not-so-great imposter. And so, Camus had said to himself, try not to seem, and this is a struggle for us. He brings up Heidegger and Sartre as people who can help us because they both thematize these questions, right? And he says the phenomenological story in something smaller than a nutshell is this. Dasein, that's us, is cast into existence with distinct abilities in a nexus of culture and history, and we're fallen, right? And we have to figure out what is really us and what is coming from other things, where our authenticity is going to lie. And then he's going to, once again, return to Kierkegaard. And he says, Kierkegaard gives us another vista on this. And it has to do with knowledge, knowing, right? And he's going to tell us that knowledge is more than justified true belief. It involves something deeper, at least in certain cases. Now, here's where we get to the chapters that are perhaps even more interesting. There's a chapter on faith. And, understandably, Kierkegaard is going to play a lot of role in that, but so is Marino's own story. And he's going to talk about losing his own faith. And he says, here's a question. Do we lose our faith or do we push it away? And he says, it felt as though some beastly hammer blows had knocked the spiritual breath, my hope and prayers out of me, but maybe not. Maybe losing your faith is not like losing a set of keys, right? Maybe it's something different where we have more activeness in it. And he talks about in a history of philosophy class going over Anselm's ontological argument. He gives about a page to it, and students don't find the flaw. He finds a defect in Anselm's reasoning. And then he brings up Kierkegaardian's views that if faith could be grounded in reason, there'd be no reason for faith. You can't climb to heaven on a ladder of syllogisms or the likes of the ontological argument. And then one of his students says, I don't understand. Why would the Creator provide us with reason and then put himself beyond reason? It doesn't make any sense, right? And then he discusses some cases. So this is like setting the situation, we could say. And he returns to Kierkegaard, and this is something quite interesting. In Kierkegaard, there are characters who themselves are not religious, but they can see the religious people and they can think about that. That is Marino in relation to Kierkegaard in this work. He says, one of my go-to narratives has long been that Kierkegaard came to my rescue at a time when I didn't much care whether I lived or disappeared. Though dead for 150 plus years, Kierkegaard was a therapist of mine. Much of his therapy took the form of spurring me in the direction of taking faith more seriously. Right? He resurrected whatever vague longing it was that had me pedaling my bike to early morning mass 55 years ago. I tended to forget about the peace that I'd prayed for and to some extent had been granted, right? So that is quite interesting. And he's going to talk near the end of this chapter about different levels of self-understanding so that I could understand the funk that I was in when I stopped to try to light a candle for my father as a function of both past experiences and neurochemistry, right? And philosophers from Hume onward often look at the self as a fiction, but Kierkegaard is a true believer in the self as an entity, and that and as a task. There's no universal definition of the self because the self is a particular. So it's our duty to become our true self, and this is going to involve some sort of movement of faith. And he rightly points out Kierkegaard doesn't use the word leap of faith. He does talk about a leap at certain points, but he doesn't call it the leap of faith, which other people have done. And then he at the end, he says, the decisive question about faith is how we relate to our beliefs and feelings. When you lack all conviction, do you chase after it or throw up your hands and say, thank God I've outgrown those superstitions? But for not so holy fools like the present author, it seems perfectly fitting to pray to a God that you don't believe in for faith in God. Something rather paradoxical. And at the very end he says, if we lose our faith, it is on purpose. It is our own doing. So some pretty interesting insights there. Then there's a section on morality. And he says, you'd expect the existentialists, they're so interested in unifying thought and action, they should have developed some kind of ethical guide to help us distinguish between right and wrong. Did they? Well, it doesn't appear so. I mean, Heidegger is totally allergic to that sort of thing. Sartre, hints at it in Being and Nothingness. De Beauvoir tried to make good on Sartre's promise with her ethics of ambiguity, but she found that less satisfying. Camus doesn't provide us with an ethics. in that sense either, although in the myth of Sisyphus and in other places he does actually chart out a number of ethical possibilities and paths. And so he is going to focus a lot on the negative, less on the positive, right? And he brings up, at first, Sartre's notion of bad faith. Now, this is an idea coming out of being in nothingness. A person lies to themselves about what the situation that they're in is and what their responsibility is, and then conceals the lie as best they can from themselves. And we should try to avoid falling into that, or when we do fall into it, acknowledge it and move on. That's not yet a positive ethic, right? He brings up Nietzsche as well, and he talks about the genealogy of morals. He gives you kind of a standard take on Nietzsche from that, and he also is going to say, now this is an interesting thing. Nietzsche declares the grand moral theories of most philosophers are essentially self-portraits, so they're not universal, right? They're coming out of their particular situation. And then he's going to get to a couple other things which are a bit more positive. So he talks about the need for courage, and he's going to use a boxing metaphor. He says, Nietzsche emphasizes the urgent importance of being able to get into the ring with your fears. Embrace the trials that tempt us to call in sick because they're the pathway to becoming who we are. Right? So that's good. And then he's also going to talk about another thing coming from Nietzsche, forgetting. Rather than forgiving, keeping things there and getting over them, whether it's ourself or others, actually setting them aside. And he says, there's a robust industry today of forgiveness experts. A lot of it is actually not going to be all that helpful. So we should, try to do what it is that Nietzsche was doing. And then he comes back again to Kierkegaard. And he's going to say, Kierkegaard wrote thousands of pages of uplifting literature, spiritual and moral self-help. Kierkegaard thought that, and this is a great part here, moral improvement is not a matter of acquiring more knowledge or skills of analysis. Kierkegaard did not believe the task of offering ethical religious instruction was one of transmitting knowledge. He reconsidered what it meant and how to go about communicating the truths that matter, the truths that are a way of life. With ethics, there's no longer an object of knowledge to be passed along. Instead, ethical religious communication is primarily a matter of enlivening a person's relationship to their ideas. Right? So it's an awakening of things. Then we get the final chapter, which is about love. And he's going to bring up Sartre's No Exit, Camus' The Stranger, and The Fall, and say, these existentialists, it seems like there isn't a possibility for genuine love there. And then, of course, we have Kierkegaard, who wrote works of love. Right? So we come back to Kierkegaard. He also talks about Kierkegaard's own, breaking the engagement with Regine. And he tells us that Kierkegaard is going to, make love something really central to his thought. And one of the things we can get out of Kierkegaard's conception is that we have to presuppose love in others, right? Not just in ourselves, but in others. And he's going to say one other thing, that Kierkegaard is leaving out something important, what he calls the feeling aspect of love. He describes love as a duty, a passion, a need, but tenderness is not foremost in his analysis. Any account of love that excludes tenderness is lacking. And I like that idea right there. He does bring up Plato's Symposium very briefly, and then looks at Dostoevsky, and mostly focusing on Notes from the Underground. And he does also talk about the possibility of love, which is left aside in the second part of that story. And, the key point that he's going to bring up, and this is kind of autobiographical at the end, is the importance of saying, I know you and I love you. Loving people who you know to be messed up beings, right? So that's, I would say, a good overview of what you're going to find within this work. Okay, so what did I find good about this book? Well, it's a very thoughtful set of discussions by somebody who not only has devoted a lot of scholarship and thought to the figures that they're engaging in, but who has also clearly grappled with that thought and has spent a lot of time teaching this. He actually talks about, I brought this to my students, or when I'm coaching, I do this. He's also applied these things. He's seen, what, at least for him and the people he knows, what works, what doesn't work. So this is the fruit of a lot of reflection, and I think we're quite fortunate to have that. I like the fact that there are a lot of life stories woven into it. I think, Marino points out, and this is kind of a commonplace of existential philosophy, that you do it from where you and who you are, and he does that very well in this work. I mean, some people might find some things more relatable, some less. Me personally, in a different generation, he's an older generation, but growing up as somebody who had a chip on his shoulder, was gifted academically, didn't quite fit in, a lot of the stories, martially inclined, you can relate to quite well. I think that the book provides a lot of useful insights, which was the goal that he was intending to fulfill in it. And I think that, so the book is heavily engaged with Søren Kierkegaard, more than any other author. He shows up in every single chapter, gets a big part of each one, sometimes is the foil to Nietzsche or to Sartre, people like that. I think this is a very Kierkegaardian work, and I think that one of the things that Marino is doing, which I think is a good point, is engaging in Kierkegaardian indirect communication with this very book. I think he's also trying to do the sort of like enkindling in the singular reader what it is that Kierkegaard was trying to do. So he's really learned, Kierkegaard's lessons and applied them well without saying he was going to do that. I'm saying he's doing that. I could be wrong. Maybe that was furthest from his mind and I'm misinterpreting. But to me, if he is indeed doing that, I think that's a strong point of the work. He's showing you how it's done. A lot of very thought-provoking takes on the different thinkers who are being discussed. Even for somebody like me, who has been reading some of them for 35 years, there's things to learn in this book about those thinkers. And I also think that it's for people who don't know much about existentialism, it could be a decent intro to the existentialist movement. I'll give you some provisos in a moment. And also the situating of certain existentialists. You're not getting everybody, but you're getting, some of the representative figures, and you're getting them in a good light, a good light that helps you understand who they are and why they matter. So those are the things that I particularly liked about the work. There are a few things that I found, let's say, problematic, not bad as such, but just problematic about the work. And I do think I need to warn readers about some of them. Many of them are kind of at the level of quibbles. They're not damning or anything. But I'll talk about the more serious issue first, which is that, okay, this is not going to be a representative sample of existentialists in general. And, I will say to be fair, Marino is kind of following a common, let's call it, narrative trajectory associated with an earlier time about like who is an important existentialist and who wasn't. And, as an existentialist, you kind of pick and choose who you want to talk about. There are some glaring omissions. If you were going to take this to be a survey of important existentialist thinkers, there are some who are left out altogether. Just to give you a few examples, Lev Shestov, massively important thinker, sort of turn of the century through the 40s. Karl Jaspers doesn't get a mention at all as far as I can tell. Gabriel Marcel, massively important existentialist thinker, the guy who actually coins the word existentialism in French. Martin Buber, Rainer Maria Rilke. There's others as well, but I don't need to go too deep into that. And then there's some where they are talked about, but I would say the treatment of them is a little bit brief and maybe not all that representative. So, for example, Albert Camus, who's in this group, the one who gets the most airtime in the book, Marino only talks about Myth of Sisyphus, The Stranger, so very early works, and then The Fall, a very late work, and just passes over, well, except for a few references to notebooks, entirely passes over the big changes in Camus' point of view, like in The Rebel, Letters to a German Friend, the Plague. It's clear that Camus did thematize love in important ways, and so there's a bit missing there in the story. Simone de Beauvoir gets a brief mention, and then that's it. There's really no engagement with her work. Miguel de Unamuno gets a little bit more, but there's no reference to Tragic Sense of Life, which I think is kind of an omission. But again, each author gets to kind of talk about who they would like to. There's also something that's said that I don't find believable, which is that students today blithely use sex as a pejorative. They're incredulous when I inform them of the sexual connotations of this now commonly used word in the not too remote 1970s. I don't think that's true at all. So I don't know what happened in the classroom, but somebody's having somebody on there. And then I think the other thing that I have to say is there are some philosophical cliches that don't really hold water, that get repeated in this a bit uncritically. One is here we go. Going back to Aristotle, melancholy was regarded as the affliction of geniuses. Aristotle never said that. Seneca tells us that Aristotle said that. We don't know if that's actually true. It's not really reflected much in Aristotle's own work. So, that's one of those kind of everybody knows that, but it doesn't turn out to be the case. He brings up the famous, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, attributed to Nietzsche, which is actually in Nietzsche's work, but Nietzsche says it in a context that isn't endorsing that. It's the military mind or mindset, right? That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So, this is not that big of a deal. He does talk about the Stoics in the work. He doesn't, get them actively wrong, but it's kind of a superficial treatment. He does say the Stoics took ataraxy or peace of mind to be of supreme value. I guess technically that's correct, but they took a lot of things to be on that level, including moral goodness, rectitude, which is virtue, right? So if you're going to ask an actual Stoic, hey, only one thing, what is it that's the most important? I think a lot of them would have said virtue, not, untroubledness, which is what ataraxia is. He brings up the old famous, the Greeks had different words for love, right? The Greeks distinguished between eros, agape, and philos. Well, it'd be philia, not philos. Well, no, that's a later reconstruction. If you read the Greek literature discussing, relationships, that is not how it works at all. That's later people saying the Greeks had these different terms. Sometimes storge gets added in there, like in C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, but there's a lot of overlap, and I don't think that's a good story to tell people about that, because it just perpetuates something that's actually off. And then, we get kind of a take on what's going on in the genealogy that is not wrong, but kind of leaves stuff out. Making there's a certain narrative that's a little bit oversimplified here, and it's not that like the bad conscience came directly from the priests. And essay 2, it's very clear that it came in a political way, the strong oppressing the strong. But those are my only real criticisms or concerns that I would bring forward about the work. All right, my final thoughts. I recommend this work. I think it's quite good. Readers will get a lot out of it, particularly if you've, engaged with existentialism either briefly before or in a sustained way. If you like Kierkegaard, you're definitely going to like this work. And I think it's got a lot to offer to people who've been studying it for a long time, like myself. So I give this, a unqualified endorsement here, and I'd say that it's great work by Marino here, the Existentialist Survival Guide.